So yeah, it will be recorded, it'll be made available afterwards. And if you've got any questions, do me a favour and put them in the chat. It makes it a bit easier for me to keep my flow. Otherwise, I'll be, you know what I'm like, if you've met me before, I'm quite easy to take off on a tangent. So if you put any questions in the chat, I'll be able to pick them up when I hit a bit of a sort of a gap, and we'll be able to go back over them. Don't be shy about putting questions in there. I'll go relatively quickly on the actual session itself. As I say, it's been recorded, and obviously, as I said earlier, you will be able to come back to us and request further training on anything we covered today, or go a bit deeper on anything we covered today. But by the same token, there should be a bit of time at the end. So if you've got any burning questions, anything that you've been wondering about how you do it with appointments that you think I might be able to cover, you know, with our demo unit, we can always have a look at that as a group. We can put our heads together. Last little bit from me for now, just as a sort of preamble. I'm going to be covering System1 appointments, config and setup, and a couple of tips in here. What I'm not going to go into any great detail with today, because I know these will be fairly hot topics at the moment. I'm not going to go into great detail covering the GP appointment data categorization, you know, the sort of secondary categorization on the slot types. We'll look at how you do it, but I'm not going to go through every single one and sort of try and line it up to what you might be doing for that thing. We do have some materials about if you do need a bit of further advice on that. And again, obviously, you can come to us directly. I'm also not going to go into any great detail in today's session about the new appointments URL functionality that TPP have introduced. We will mention it. We do actually have a couple of sessions upcoming specifically on that topic, delivered by the NECS training team. So I will post a couple of links into the chat as well later in the session, just for how you can access those ones. Those will just be a deep dive on the appointments URL function. Okay, so without further ado, he says, waiting for his mouse to wake up, we shall hop into System1. And as I say, today is going to be primarily the configuration of appointments in System1. So we're going to look at a couple of sections. We're basically going to start from the ground up. I'm going to keep referring to them as building blocks or that kind of thing. Bear with me on that. We've all got our own analogies for it. And we're just going to look at a couple of circumstances in which bothering to set these bits up then starts to repay itself. So most of what happens with appointments in System1 happens from the setup menu, because you're affecting the whole unit. And we're going to talk first about a couple of things that you can do from organization preferences that might make life a little bit easier. So as a system administrator from organization preferences, you can create organization-wide bookmarks for the appointment screen. I should mention at this point, this session does assume a little bit of prior knowledge of using the appointments functionality in System1. But if you've got bookmarks, you know what it's like. Every time a new member of staff joins the organisation, you have to go and set their bookmarks individually. You can set them organisation-wide, and they'll be available for all the staff at your organisation. It's quite a nice little time saver. You can also, one that we do tend to get forgotten, and also, if I hop into the appointment screen, sorry, mine's gone a bit blank. You can configure the free slot search it's not going to let me do it on it. It's not going to let me do it. You can basically publish bookmarks for the free slot search as well. Mine's gone completely blank. I'll come back to that later. And also your staff ordering. So if I hop back into we can start to when my mouse wakes up. You can set your staff ordering organisation wide as well. So, you know, if you have all your GPs at the front of the road, you don't have to do that individually for every member of staff. Okay. So, Getting into the actual building of appointments, we are going to spend most of today's session. We're going to hop into the setup menu, into the appointments. After that, and you can see that there are a couple of sections here. And as I say, think of these as kind of building blocks, basically for building a useful appointment rota. I always refer to the rota types as kind of the bottom of the building, the foundation. And historically, your rota types used to be largely ignored. So, back in the day, most of the GP practices that we set up would just use the session type, which is a system-wide default for pretty much everything. And that was fine. You didn't tend to run that many different types of clinics. You might have a GP, nurse, HCA, but you weren't really being asked to report on types of appointment being offered to the same extent. You weren't really perhaps making those appointments available in quite so many places as you're having to now. Recent years have made rota types really start to repay them the setup time. There's a couple of things that these really do come into their own with. The first one, which I'm not going to go into excruciating detail on today, but I'm going to mention it, is your appointments reporting. So if you use the appointment reporting in System 1, and if I go into the right one, you'll notice that one of the breakdown options is the rota type. So if you're trying to differentiate, for example, between appointments offered with a GP versus appointments offered with a registrar versus appointments offered with an AMP, setting up your rota types well starts to make it a lot easier to extract that data. Now, when I say well, this is fairly subjective. The advice I tend to give when looking at rota types, basically a couple of factors. What type of person is going to be hosting that rota? What type of clinician have you got seeing those patients? What type of appointments are you expecting to be seen in that rota? And how are those appointments expected to take place? They're kind of the three things that start to determine whether you need a separate rota type to the ones you've already got. To create a new one, really straightforward. Set up appointments, rota types, new rota type. We give it a name, we can call it within reason whatever we want. You can set an age range on a rota type, really useful, but just be aware that that is very black and white. If we get topical for a second, if I set a flu rota type for patients aged between 18 and 65, if I ran that rota and during that clinic a 66-year-old came in and we just wanted to drop them on the end of it, that rota wouldn't allow me to, because that patient isn't between 18 and 65. So it's a really useful tool. It can help prevent a lot of mistakes, but by the same token, it's very black and white. It's not going to let you override it. Choose with caution. And the other tick box that you can see there, allow consultations to be started from rota of this type. Basically, it just means that a clinician can right-click and start consultation for appointments in that rota. So it's useful to have ticked for most things. If you are one of those practices that has a rota for messages, for example, or sort of GP workload, you might want to untick that. You might not want consultations to be started from that, but that's a fairly subjective thing. Okay. So rota type, like I say, think foundation. Building blocks, we then think about slot types. You can see there, got loads in our demo unit. There is a cap on them. You'll be doing well to hit it. It's recently been extended. But at the same time, I'm with everything on this side of things, huge fan of keeping things tidy. Do your housekeeping. If you stop using a slot type, consider whether you need to leave it in the list, because eventually you will hit the cap if you leave all of them in there. And it can also get fairly confusing when someone comes to build new rotas. As you'll have probably already found, when you get System 1 out of the box, there are a couple of default slot types in there, about 5 or 6. Most of them you will probably develop your own variants of those. The one that you will normally have to use if you use this functionality is the video consultation slot, because that will actually allow you to start a video consultation from a slot. So that's one of the default slot types that you will almost certainly use if you offer video consultations at your practice. Most of the others, you'll probably have found that you'll have added your own for different circumstances, and you'll probably have a fairly extensive list anyway. If I go into a new slot type, a couple of things that we have to do for these. So we have to give it a name. That's what it will present as on the rota. That's what your staff will see. We have to give it a letter. It doesn't have any tremendous bearing on anything. Don't put too much thought into it. Don't spend more time on that than you do building the slot type. They have a couple of ramifications that you're unlikely to hit routinely. If you try and import a set of slot types into another unit, there are issues where the letters clash. You can also, if you're really sad, and even I'm not that sad, but somebody on here will be, I'm sure, and they're going to, sort of tear into me afterwards. You can build your rotas as a formula using the letter that you've assigned to each slot rather than dragging and dropping them, as we're going to see in a second. I don't know anyone that does that, so I'm not going to go into that in excruciating detail again. You can increase the number of patients per slot for a slot type, which may be useful if you, for example, if you offer group appointments, if you offer sessions for multiple people. Not typically for general practice, I'd say. We used to use this a fair bit in the community where we had some group sessions in the mental health units. But that will basically allow you to book more than one patient into a slot up to the number that you set there. The type, so this is where we start to get into the real, the bread and butter. Bookable means that a slot can be booked by anyone with rights to book an appointment on your unit. That includes staff. That also includes patients via online access, as long as the online services bit set up, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. And it also means that a slot can be booked remotely if you set that kind of agreement up, which we'll talk about in a couple of minutes. Embargo, as you probably already know, requires a specific set of access rights to be able to book an embargo slot or to be able to override an embargo. Generally speaking, you'll find that people can override embargoes in a rota of which they are the owner. So if your embargo slot's in a GP's rota, they can probably still book them. But for anyone else, they have to have the access right to override embargoed slots, basically. It's worth mentioning at this point, you set a slot type as being able to be embargoed. At this point, you don't set how long the embargo is in place for. And that'll make a bit more sense when I start putting a rota together. But we'll have a look at how you actually determine how long an embargo lasts. For the purpose of this one, I'm just going to give it my initials so I can find it later. And we'll call this one just so I can illustrate that point later. So we'll make it embargoable. Blocks, you tend to use things like breaks, lunches, meetings, that kind of thing. A block slot cannot be booked. Even if you're a system administrator, you cannot book into a block slot. You would have to physically change the slot type to be able to book a patient into it. To the right of that, we've got bookable through remote booking. We are going to talk a little bit about remote booking later on. Basically, if you make a slot bookable through remote booking here, it doesn't mean that anyone else will be able to use it straight off the bat. You will still have to make the rota that it's in remote bookable. You would have to define who it's remotely bookable by. You would also have to do a bit of setup on both units to allow them to talk to each other. So don't worry too much about unticking the bookable through remote booking checkbox if you don't intend other people to use that slot. It's not going to make it available to them unless you do a fair bit of setup elsewhere. Enable SMS reminders. So if you use the Systmone SMS reminder functionality, this slot type will be available to send reminders for. It doesn't again necessarily mean that they will go. It will still also have to meet the parameters set on the machine that sends the SMS reminders, but it means the slot type can have SMS reminders sent for it. So again, you might want to turn that off if it's something that the patient is actually going to come to the practice for. You can make sure that that slot isn't included in any of those lists while I'm taking that. And then we come to the national slot type category, the GP appointments data categorization. I'm not going to go through every option in this list and try and match them to what you might do in them, because you guys will be better placed than I. Now, I would assume to to talk about that. We do have some information available if anyone would benefit from that. But essentially, you do have to set a national slot type against your local slot types. So for this one, it's going to be a 5-day embargo. I'm going to do this as a face-to-face. So we'll call this care-related activity. Sorry, care-related encounter. Let's go general consultation acute. Actually, let's go routine because we're saying 5 days in the future. Description, basically, if you want to give someone a little bit more information about what the slot type's for, so I could put in there. Back in the day when we used to have to offer lots of pre-bookables, and we used to try and stagger them so they didn't all go as soon as we put them on. Now the colour. Use rota colour will basically take the rota background, which we'll see in a second. Use specific colour, where we get the extensive colourful appointment books from in Systmone. Basically, pick something that will make sense internally. Let's make this one bright blue. Colour once embargo expires. Again, everyone takes this slightly differently. A lot of places will take a slightly brighter or slightly darker version of the slot colour, just so it jumps out to people that it's now open. Some people have them all turn white when they are available. It's completely up to you as a practice, but essentially that's what it will be on the road to when the embargo still applies. That's what it will look like once the embargo time has passed. Now the appointment flags, get a lot of questions about this. A lot of the appointment flags won't really apply into the day-to-day, especially not in general practice. Some of them have uses, some places use them fairly extensively, most don't. There are a couple, however, that have functional implications for the appointment. So I'll mention a couple of the primary ones. A personal favourite of mine is the prevent self-checking. Again, slightly different circumstances last couple of years, but historically, used to use that. I'll take an example. If we were running a minor surgery clinic and we wanted the patients to sign a consent form before they went in to see the clinician, if they self-check in, they might not necessarily think to come and grab one of those from reception. So for that rota, for that slot, we might want to prevent themselves using the self-check-in, so they have to come to reception and receive the form. If we have a patient group, for example, that needs to be taken somewhere else in the building, we might prevent self-check-in, so they come to reception and don't go and wait in the waiting room where they're not going to be, they're not going to see the call. Worth mentioning that you can also apply these to individual appointments. So this will apply as a default for the slot, but you can then apply these flags individually to appointments as well. Say patient self-check-in, prevent self-check-in, I should say. I used to use if we needed to confirm a patient's mobile number, for example, or their home address or something like that, or give them a sample bottle before they went in. But if we set it here, it's going to apply by default to that slot. It might be here, for example, that we might want to do some COVID screening questions with them. We've probably already done those, but we might want to catch them before they go into a room with a clinician. A couple of others worth mentioning. Telephone appointment. So if we set the telephone appointment flag, when we start consultation from that appointment, it's going to assume that it's actually taking place as a telephone appointment, not as a face-to-face clinically relevant contact. A couple of the other ones, really, they just put little flags, little colourful lines down the side of the appointment in the rota. So, for example, we used to use emergency appointment for hour on the day, and it just put a little red line down the side of the appointment, so we knew that had been booked acutely rather than routinely. Use them as far as they're useful to your practice is probably the best advice I can give with the appointment flags. Finally, down here, we've got options for sending confirmations and cancellations. So if your unit is set by default to send SMS confirmations, if you're set up to use the Systmone SMS functionality, you can say that this type of slot always sends a confirmation. You can say that it never sends a confirmation, or you can say it just follows the behaviour of the rest of the slots of the unit. And the same with cancellation messages. Okay. So with that, Forgot the most important bit, obviously, the letter. Like I say, don't dwell on it too much. Pick the one at the bottom. You do have to set one, but you're unlikely to use it day to day. So there's our slot that we've just created. Okay. So now that we've created a slot type, I'm going to go back on myself slightly just to illustrate the point. I'm going to create a rota type as well, just for the purposes of this session. So let's say this is, and I'm not going to set an age range on it. So we've got a rota type, we've got a slot type. What we can do now is we can put those together to create a rota template, and this is where most of the work creating appointments goes. Before I do that, I'm going to mention appointment rooms. Can be useful. Appointment rooms is a bit of a contentious one. It's a little bit like branches, really, if you've got branches at your surgery, because they can start to help prevent double bookings. So we've found with practices where they have a fairly large site, they might have you know, some degree of turnover, they might have some external staff in as well, or similarly, where we've got a particularly small site and effectively each room might have one of 3 or 4 people in it on a given day. Setting up your appointment rooms can help prevent double bookings. By the same token, I find a lot of practices don't really find it's worth the effort is probably the wrong word, but they find that actually they tend to know who's in each room on a given day. For the purposes of this, we'll create one. And as you can see there, we give it a name. We also give it a location. So these are the branch sites that are set up on my unit. Again, can come in quite handy if you're putting someone into room 1 and you need to know at your practice which room 1 you're referring to, so you don't end up with 2 GPs trying to get in room 1 on the same site. That's your appointment rooms. So we've got a rota type, that's our foundation. We've got our slot type, that's our building blocks. We've got our rooms, or somewhere in between the two. We're going to look at creating a new template. Now, as you can see there, in our list, we've got dozens, 89 as a matter of fact, and in most of the practices that I've been out to, you'll have a similar kind of number. This varies wildly, basically. Tends to be more with GPs, that you might have multiple different variations. If you've got a GP that starts sort of 8 o'clock on Monday morning, goes through to 11, they come in at 9:30 on Tuesday and go through till 12:30. They come in at 9 on Wednesday and go till 12, etc., and then they do the same kind of thing in the afternoon. You could feasibly end up with 10 different rota templates for 10 different sessions. Similarly, you might have a GP who's really quite regimented, and you just have a Dr. Ross AM session, Dr. Ross PM session. She always does the same hours and always does them in the same format. Some places will vary GP routine, duty doctor kind of rota. A million and one different permutations of this. I'm not going to try and explain them all today, but we're just going to have a look at how you actually put one of these together. So we've created a new rota template. We're on our rota design. We can assign it to a member of staff. Now, to appear in this list, and you'll probably have met this before, the member of staff has to have the access right sees patients set on their local profile. It's not a smart card right, it's one you actually have to apply after they've logged into your unit for the first time. So I'm going to pick on myself. This is the only time I'll be assigning a patient-facing rota to myself. Rota site, that's the branch effectively. So if you've only got one building for your practice, you only have one site. If you have multiples, you obviously assign it here. I'm going to mention branches a little bit later as well, especially at the moment, because we're getting a lot of practices that will host their flu clinics off-site at a sort of a larger premises to allow for distancing, etc. So I will show you how to add a branch, which will then populate into the rota site. If we've set up rooms, as in the last step, we can assign them here. We don't have to assign this field if we don't find it useful. we can also configure new rooms from the button to the right. Caseload, there are uses for them, but I'm going to go on record as saying I've not actually seen any GP practices using caseloads. So we're not going to cover that today. The rota type, there it is, the old default session. I'm going to pick up on my new GP face-to-face specifically for this training. And again, you can see there, if you've forgotten to do your rota type, you can create a new one from this one here, or you can configure the available from the button here. The name, this is what's going to show actually on the appointments rota. So this is what your staff are going to see. Be as descriptive as you need to be, really. So I'm going to call this one, let's say it was routine AM. I'm going to be one of those wonderful GPs that does the same hours every day of every week. Location type, we're going to leave for now. They tend not to be particularly useful for general practice. The start time we can define. So I'm going to say that I kick off every morning at 9 o'clock. We can't define the end time for our rota. The end time will be calculated from the slots that we put in. We can define how often this rota repeats and on what schedule. Now, again, we're going to take this one of those wonderful GPs that works. Let's say I work Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday. And every Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, I do the same hours. When I'm applying my rotas, I might not want to have to do it, every day. If I'm applying them for a month, I might want to set my rota to auto-apply, which we'll talk about in a second. Which is all well and good, but I don't want it to automatically apply on my day off. I don't want it to automatically apply on Wednesday. This repeat schedule here basically defines within a time period that you've set the rota to apply, which days it will apply on. What this doesn't do is prevent you from applying the rota to a day that is not ticked, or from applying the rota ad hoc outside the schedule. Say, for example, on a given week, I decide that I'm going to do a Wednesday morning because one of my GPs is on leave, and I'm going to do a locum session to sort of make up the space. When I come to apply the rota, I can tell it in that instance to apply it on a Wednesday, but by default, it's not going to, so I'm not going to accidentally apply it to every Wednesday. Background colour, again, absolutely practice preference. We've got a couple that will define, sort of urgent versus routine with different colours. We've got at least one that springs to mind that has 3 sites. They colour each of their sites differently. Basically, whatever helps it to jump out to your staff. I'm going to leave it as the default green for now. And the text colour is obviously the text in the boxes. The format, that's the bit I mentioned earlier, the bit where you can, if you want to, create your rotas with a formula rather than by adding slots to the box below. So if I type HZ*10, that was the slot I created, the abbreviated letter form, times 10. At least I think it was, but I'm not going to go down that route for now because most people won't. Instead, I'm going to do it the usual way. I'm going to add my slots to my rota. So I can pick my slot type from the list. By default, I've told it that my appointment's 10 minutes, so it's assumed that I want all of these to be 10 minutes. And it asks me how many do I want to apply to my rota. So let's say I do 10 in a row. 10 appointments back to back. This is where we come to the point of setting our embargo duration. So as we mentioned before, on the slot type, you make a slot embargoable. From the appointment from the rota template, you tell the rota how far in advance that appointment is embargoed. So I've made it a 5-day. So I want my embargo to expire 5 days before the actual appointment. I want people to be able to book that within the 5 days before the appointment. And you set the embargo expiry time. Now, years and years ago, when some of us first started in general practice, you didn't have to worry too much about this because the phones opened at 8 a.m. and that was the first opportunity anyone got to book one of them. However, now that we're offering things online, or we were fairly extensively before everything happened, we start to have to think, okay, well, this will lift the embargo for everybody that has access to that appointment, including, if it's made available that way, patients through the online services. So, find now that a lot of places will lift the embargo on their appointments at 8 a.m. on the day they want them to release. Otherwise, you get those crafty people that will twig that if they log on at 5 minutes past midnight, they can see all the newly populated appointments. Is that okay? And you can see there, gives me a little preview down the side. It's put 10 appointments. One after the other in a solid block, because I specified that I wanted 10 of them. I might then say, okay, at 10:40, sorry, because that's when that slot finishes, I'm going to add a break slot in. So I might only want to add one of those. It'll be fairly hard on myself. And then I might say, okay, let's add another 10 of my 5-day embargo. So expiring 5 days before at 8 o'clock. There we go. And we start to get what looks like a fairly sensible rota. So you can see there I'm going from 9 till 12:30 with a break in the middle. And you can see there that it's populated the end time of my rota by calculating for the number of slots and their duration. Now from here, we can right click on individual slots, we can amend them, we can delete them, we can merge them together. So if I wanted to offer a couple of 20-minute ones, we can merge. We can also split if we've got one that's joined together that we need to split into 2 10s. You can see there, it's turning the 20 into 2 10s. And that, in a nutshell, is how we put a rota template together. Now, if we're going to put that in our practice, that's fine. That's all we need to do. If we want that to be available through remote booking to other Systmone units, we have to make the template itself remotely bookable by creating a share with the unit that we want to allow booking into our rota. Now, this isn't something that most of us are going to worry about day to day in general practice, but this is where we come into the realms of hub working, sort of shared professionals, that kind of thing. Well, we could say, I want to share this rota with, and it'll let me search the Systmone unit browser. I can limit how many appointments they can book remotely, and I can limit how far in advance of the appointment they can book, and I can also stop them booking so far in advance of the rota. So, you know, it used to be with the hubs, for example, when we used to do the on-day kind of setting, the evening setting, you might say, okay, well, the practices can book on the day of the rota. So the booking window starts no days before. It opens at 8 o'clock and it closes at 5 o'clock. So we don't get people booking them in at last minute. We've got a bit of time to sort of look at what's coming down. As I say, not something we're going to worry about too much in general practice, but if you are in one of those PCNs where you maybe host staff on behalf of the rest of the PCN, this might be something you start to look at in the future. And we can, of course, look at that with you in a bit more detail if you find that you need to in the future. Resources, again, it's not something we tend to see set up too often, really, but you can link particular pieces of equipment or particular staff to an appointment rota. Say, for example, you're a fairly big practice, but you've got 2 ECG machines and you want to make sure that they are tied to the rota that you're building. You can do that. Doesn't tend to be used too commonly, in my experience. And we can also tell a rota that we want it to automatically apply. Now, this is a little bit to be used with caution again. Basically, we can tell Systmone, for example, that once we apply this template, we want it to stay on for, let's say, 8 weeks into the future, starting from today. And we get a bit of guidance down here just as to how that will work. So at the end of each week, basically, in the first week, System 1 will apply the 8 weeks. And then at the end of each week, System 1 will effectively apply week 9. So you kind of always end up having a new week on as the old week passes. It does work very well. It will factor in staff leave, close days, etc., which I'm going to mention in a second. It will also factor in conflict. So if you automatically apply your rotas, but you use that member of staff for a different rota as well, it won't automatically apply it. Instead, you'll get a task advising that there was a conflict that prevented it being automatically applied. But it does mean that those rotas will roll on and keep themselves applied. So if you have a member of staff that leaves, you will then have to go and take off any automatically applied rotas. You'll have to go and sort of stop. You have to come back to the template and stop it automatically applying by removing these settings. Okay. So if I say OK, that's going to save my rota template into my list of rota templates. It'll also sit under me because I'm the clinician to which it was assigned. You can see there I've done this before. Once we've built a rota template, we then have to apply it for it to appear on the appointments ledger and the appointments overview. And to do that, the easiest way is to right click and say apply. This is where our repeat schedule comes into play. Because if I, for example, said that I wanted to apply this rota for the whole of October, it will do, based on me setting those 2 dates, but it will skip the Wednesdays because I told it that I don't work on a Wednesday. If for this application, I were to tick Wednesday, it would apply it every day between 9 and 12:30. But the next time I came to apply this rota, we'll do it. If I say OK, the next time I come to apply the rota, you'll notice that Wednesday isn't ticked because as part of the rota template, when I set that up, when I created it, we didn't set Wednesday as an option. We set it ad hoc for that one application for October. Similarly, even though it's a template, you can change it for this application. So if, for example, in November, I decided that I was only going to do half of my usual morning, it will let me do that. I find the break. So I can highlight those and delete them. And I can apply that for November. But again, when I go back to my rota template, it's not changed the underlying template. It's only changed it for that one ad hoc application. Similarly, if I change out a handful of slots, so if I maybe made some of the first few in my list, let's go for those 3. If we made them teledermatology appointments for this one application for December, it's not going to change the underlying rota. So the next time I come to apply it, those 3 appointments will still be my 5-day face-to-face because that's what I added to the original template. Now, picking on December brings me to another important point, close days. So we can see here we've got the Christmas holiday defined. So if I apply this one for December, it's going to give me a warning to say, you've got some close days in that period. Do you want to create the rota on those holidays? I'm going to say skip. Don't intend to be seeing patients on Christmas Day. I don't intend to be seeing patients full stop. That's not what I'm here for, as you probably guessed from the fact that I'm leading this session. If we go to our appointment book now, and I filter down to just myself, and let's have a look at some of the ones in October. So you can see there, because that appointment has expired, because that's less than 5 working days in the future, they've gone white. That one hasn't expired yet, so that's still blue. If we jump forward a little bit to November, you'll see that I have sessions on the Wednesday. Sorry, I don't have sessions on the Wednesdays because I didn't apply them for November, whereas for October I do. And if we jump forward to December, you'll see that there's a couple of teledermatology slots because I changed the rota for that application. Okay. So I hope that's sort of made fairly clear how the appointment rota templates work. They basically act as a bit of a springboard if you are lucky and the person that you're applying them for follows the same format every time, same place, then they become really quite straightforward. But you do have the option to amend them on the fly and it won't change the underlying template. Okay. So while we're talking about slots and templates, we'll come back to what I mentioned earlier, free slot search. You can configure the free slot search, which I'm sure most of you have seen. I'd guess that a number I haven't used extensively. You can configure free slot search presets to be available for practice. So if I call this one, for example, I look for my pre-bookable slots, I could say that I want to look for appointments with me on any day of the week, starting from today for the next, let's say, 2 months, any time of day, but I only want to find any that sit in my GP face-to-face rota, and I only want to see slots that are my 5-day embargo. And I can set it as a bookmark by clicking on corresponding square there. If I then come to my free slot searches, so I'm in my appointment rota, go to free slot search. Might take a second. I just have to come out and go back in. It's going to take a while for me, but we can configure those and publish them again from setup appointments, free slot search config. And we can change them there as well. So if I added a new couple of slot types in there, we'd be able to pick that up. We'd be able to amend our free slot search to pick those up. Okay. Another piece of functionality when we come to appointments that's massively underused, and again, it's one of those things that requires quite a lot of setup and quite a lot of maintenance, but it really does start to repay itself quite quickly. Again, found in the setup and appointments, we've got appointment templates, not to be confused with rota templates that we just looked at, not to be confused with slot types. An appointment template effectively works like the spreadsheet or the laminated piece of paper, or however your practice does it, that you give to people when they're getting used to booking appointments, that says, for this type of appointment, we always allow 20 minutes. This type of appointment has to be with one of these 3 people. These nurses will be able to see this type of problem. So, like I say, we've all got a different way of doing it. Most of us have a sort of list on the shared drive, that kind of thing. But if we build an appointment template for that appointment time, whenever anyone goes to book it, they can pick up that template, and the system one can then pop up information to them, or it can tell them if they're not booking quite long enough. There's a few things it can do. So I'll pick on, I'll go back into my history of it here. We'll talk about when we used to be in our old building. So we had 2 nurse rooms effectively. One of those nurse rooms was a proper sort of consultation room. One was effectively a converted room cupboard. So we used to be able to do a lot of the chronic disease reviews from there, but we couldn't do procedures that needed somebody to lie down. We couldn't, for example, do smears from this room. There was no space to physically do anything like that. So we built, as one of our appointment templates, we call it give it a name that will mean something to the person booking it, and an icon that will jump out at them. This is the bit that definitely takes the longest when it comes to setting up appointment templates, picking the icon. We can tell System1 how long we expect that appointment to last. The beauty of that is, if I try and book using this appointment template into a slot, if there is space to extend it, in this case to 20 minutes, it'll do so without me having to do anything. If there's not space to extend to the duration set here, System1 will actually warn the user. You get a little pop-up that says, the slot you're using isn't long enough for this appointment template. Do you want to book it anyway? It won't stop anyone booking it, but it at least gives them a bit of a prompt. So actually, I should probably have a word with the person I'm booking this in with first, just to see if they can squeeze it in. Text is set, that will set the appointment details for us. So in this case, it seems sensible just to set the name of the appointment, just to tell the person who's going to be seeing that what they're going to be seeing. Flags to set, again, might come into play for certain types of appointment. Again, going back to what I said earlier about the minor surgery. So minor surgery excision, for example, one of my appointment templates would probably have been set to 30 minutes duration, and would have probably had the prevent self-check-in set, so I could give them their consent form before they went to see the GP. Staff reminder, this is where these really come into their own. The staff reminder basically gives a message that will pop up to the person using the appointment template. And again, I'm going to go back to my roots here, and I'm going to set this up as we used to have hours. So first thing was for hours, who normally did them. So let's name some names. Wendy, Julie, or Joe. That would have meant something to the people in my practice at the time. Important bit, it had to be in room 5 because room 1 was too small. Now, if somebody was new to the practice, they might have looked at room 1 and said, oh, that's the nurse room, we can probably do it in there. That's how we tell them not to. And because of what we're doing, we also had a message on there that said, because obviously we can't keep the sample over the weekend. So what these appointment templates do is they effectively allow you to put a little U on the shoulder of everyone in your practice that might be booking appointments, just to catch some of the things that get forgotten when booking that type of appointment. You can link a leaflet URL, so a web link, if you want to, if it's something you want to sort of pop up to recommend printing when we book this type of appointment, or similarly, we can pull an image from the document library and recommend printing that if we've got it saved in System1 that way. We can also link these to rotas, but this to certain staff roles, sorry, but this gets a little bit, again, a little bit black and white. We could say, for example, that it could only be booked with nurse access role, but that would then stop us booking this in with any GPs. So we'd have to be a little bit careful with that one. Okay, so that's all there is to building a new appointment template. What that means, if I go to my appointments, I'm going to override the embargo because I've got the power to do so on this unit. And I'll pick on my test patient. It's going to get a bit strange because it is a chat, but don't read too much into this. And we pick our template from here on the right-hand side. You can see there, it's popped up the information that I populated in the last step. It's extended my slot to 20 minutes because there is space to do so, and it's populated my appointment details. Now, as I say, this is a little bit of a piece of work when you first start out, and it'll normally need at least a fair bit of input from your clinicians. That might need your practice nurses to look at it and say, okay, well, what equipment do we need to make sure is in the room before we do this appointment? Or, do we need a GP to be on site as we do for some things? All these kind of considerations. But it basically gives us a vehicle to convey that to anybody in the practice who goes to book that type of appointment. So if you've got a high turnover of new receptionists, for example, and every time you have to spend 2 or 3 weeks with them, teaching them who does what, how long for, and what they need in place before they do it, absolutely would encourage you to look at setting up your appointment templates. And as long as somebody in the practice keeps a decent eye on these and updates them, if you decide that you're going to you get another member of staff, for example, that can do B12 injections, or that you're going to allow an extra 10 minutes on chronic disease reviews because we've been given something else to do in general practice. As long as somebody's keeping these up to date, it'll save hours of training time. Okay, that's my appointment template. I'm going to go back a step now. I'm going to dive back into our user and policy folder under setup. We're going to talk about a couple of the other things that we can use to prevent double booking, or to prevent overbooking, or to govern who's going to be where and when. So the first one we're going to talk about, and we'll do this at quite a high level, from the staff and organisation setup node, is branches. We can, on System 1, create branches for our practice. Don't think of these too rigidly in terms of being an actual physical branch of the practice. You can use these basically to create a new appointments location. So say, for example, as a lot of practices are doing at the moment, you've got you're holding your flu clinics maybe at sort of a social club or something that offers a little bit more space, a little bit of room to sort of spread out and maintain distance. Or we could create that as a branch. All we need basically is the address, the name, etc. If we create it as a branch, it becomes available as a location. You can see there at the bottom is a checkbox, can be rota site. I'd normally say uncheck, can be patient's usual branch, can be stock site, because you're unlikely to use those unless they are actually a branch of your practice. But can be rota site means basically that rotas can be hosted there. If you've set something up as a branch, it will appear in the appointments ledger or overview in the site filter. So you can see there the branch that we've already created. Excuse me. It will also appear as an option when we go to create a rota template. It will appear as one of our rota sites, so we can start to differentiate where things are going to happen. Also then starts to have ramifications for things like text messaging. So if your text messages are set to use the rota site as one of their fields, it'll obviously pick up when it sends a text to the patient to tell them to go to the branch rather than to the main site. Also from the setup menu, we have the option to record staff leave. Generally speaking, and it is a generalisation, some places will do it for everyone, but generally speaking, staff leave gets used for clinicians, and it basically gets used for anyone that's likely to want to have a rota assigned to them. It'll basically prevent a rota applying on a day that's set as a leave day for that member of staff, because obviously if they're on leave, they're not going to be seeing patients. Similarly, we have the option to record public holidays and close days. So bank holidays, quest days, etc. They'll prevent the accidental application of a rota to a given day. So if your quest day is, the Wednesday afternoon, you can set a new close day, give it a name, you can make it a PM event, you can give it a description, and it'll stop rotas being applied that afternoon. The AM and PM part, I should mention, picks up from this section is set up, user policy, excuse me, and organisation preferences. Under the appointments menu, you have days and times, and you can define when your morning and afternoon surgery is run. Similarly, you can define your open days. So if you do start opening on Saturday mornings, for example, you can define that that's also an open day. It will allow rotas, etc., to be applied to them. Okay. So they are the basics of setting up appointments and rotas for your organisation. as I say, we have some further information available on the GP appointment data. So if anyone would like that, I can sort of make sure that gets across to Laura for circulation. We also, elephant in the room at the moment, we are running some separate sessions on the patient appointment invitations. So you've probably seen this by now, but I'm going to mention it relatively quickly for now, with the offer of a bit of a deep dive if you want to take that up. Basically, System 1 now has functionality to allow you to text patients with a unique appointment URL, very similar to how SwiftQueue worked when we were booking the early COVID jabs. And we can associate that URL, that link, with a rota type. Going back to what I said earlier about how rota types are really starting to come into their own. So if I go into my setup using policy and organisation preferences and come to my patient appointment invitations, basically we can tell System 1 what we might want to offer as appointment reasons. So the text messages that we might be sending out to patients. We can tell System 1 for a text message of that type what rota that patient will be able to use. Now, the initial intention for this was COVID vaccinations, so first and second. The idea being that you could ping all your patients that would do their first COVID vaccination a text to say, would you like to book in for an appointment? Click here, follow the link, and we'll let you in. Or, you know, you've had one, would you like to book for your second one? Click here, follow the link, and you'll only see the rota in which we're giving second vaccinations. Smart practices started to get creative with that. So obviously flu season's coming around. You can create these for an over 65 flu rota, an under 65 flu rota, kids flu. You can go a little bit further than that. You can start to do this, for example, one of the ideas that I've heard put forward is smear clinics. So you have a rota type of smear clinic, you have a slot type of smear, obviously, and you have an invitation type of smear. You draw up a report or list of all the patients that are due, maybe in the next month. You send them all the invitation URL and allow them basically to pick from the open slots in that rota. We can't go anywhere else because that rota type is linked to the appointment type. So we can't go booking on the GP face-to-face. But it means that they can basically see what's available and you can operate a first come, first served without having all the patients ringing the practice. Got another couple of practices that are looking at doing this for chronic disease reviews. So basically offering a sort of staple chronic disease review to patients that will only need maybe the 20 minutes, single comorbidity, that kind of thing. But there's a lot of scope to get creative with this. I've got a question from Karen on that. But when sending the SMS, does it have to be from the System 1 or can AccuX be used for the URL link to the appointment slots? So the System 1 appointment invitations will send using the System 1 SMS. They'll show you the URL so you can actually copy and paste that into AccuX. But the functionality itself will use the System 1 SMS rather than a third party. Okay, so what I will do, I'll again, with any information around the GP appointments data, I will forward a link to our website, so the NECS Learning website. We have a couple of sessions booked on there at the moment for the appointment invitation configuration. We'll go into a fair bit of detail on that, so if you want to join, by all means grab one of those slots available to practices that fall under our usual support bubble. Okay, the other thing I want to mention here, and again, it's going to be like the rest of this session, it's going to be really reasonably high overview, but we're going to have a quick look at the online services provision of appointments and a couple of the settings that start to govern what's available and what's not available through there. So, as with most things that affect the whole of your organisation, they're found in the organisation preferences. They sit under online services. And as you've probably guessed, they sit under appointment booking. So obviously you have to enable it for your organisation. You can tell System 1 how far in advance you want your patient to be able to book. So in this case, we're set to allow 4 weeks into the future. We can prevent appointment booking, so we can say that somebody can't book one in the next 10 minutes when they're never going to be able to make it there. You know, you'll know your practice area. You'll know if most of your patients actually live within 10 minutes walk of the practice and probably could make it there that quickly. You can limit to the first available slots in the rota. So what that will do, basically, it'll force patients to fill in from the top. You know, if you're offering so many on the day appointments, but you don't want people booking, you know, 10:30, 11, 11:30, you want them all to be booked near the start, so those ones don't go to waste. You can sort of force that. You can restrict the number of future appointments that patients can have booked, so you don't get somebody booking 5 and then picking the one that they want to actually come to. You can restrict how far in advance patients can book. You can restrict patients to their usual branch if you're so inclined. You know, if you do find that you're getting a lot of patients booked for branch sites that they can't then physically get to. But by the same token, again, it's very black and white, so it won't let them make the choice. It will restrict them to their usual branch. Same with usual GP. Minimum bookable slot length. So again, you can say that they can only book slots of a certain length. Not that that tends to get used too often, because I would imagine most of the slots being offered in this format are going to be about 10 minutes. You can restrict which slot types are bookable. You can restrict which rota types are bookable, and you can restrict which clinicians are bookable. Now, this works very similar to the appointment invitation URLs. Basically, for something to be bookable, it has to meet all 3 of these criteria. So, for example, if we said that all of our clinicians were bookable, but they were only bookable in my face-to-face clinic, let's say the session clinics, that's normally used for the GP stuff, or in the GP registrar or clinic rota types. And we could say that only the slot types of, well, in this case, you can see here, let's lose the telephone. Let's go for patient appointment slot. Let's do the same day ones on as well. So, a patient with online access to our service with the right to book appointments online would be able to book any of these slot types as long as, 1, they appeared in one of these rota types. So they won't be able to book a slot that appeared in my nurse rota type, for example, or in my mental health rota type. They'd only be able to book it if it met these rota types. They'd be able to book it with any clinician that was seeing one of these rota types, because we've not restricted that. And they'd be able to book it as long as the appointment was available, i.e. it wasn't booked by someone else and it wasn't currently embargoed. This comes back to the point I was making earlier. If our appointment has an embargo applied to it, so it will stop our receptionist booking it, it will also stop our patients booking it through the online services. However, when the embargo ends for our staff, it will also end for patients. Hence that point about setting your embargo expiry time at 8 o'clock rather than midnight, or whenever you want them to be available to people who are looking online. Okay. Again, fairly high level overview of the online appointments booking. Can go into that obviously in more detail. We can obviously do some sort of one-to-one or group work with your practice or practices if you want to look at refining that a little bit, or if you're starting to look at turning some bits of that back on. So, on that note, a couple of ideas, hopefully. That's the idea of this session, is to spark brain waves, to get you thinking of ways that you can basically streamline the way that your practice handles appointments, maybe some of the config that you do that then starts to make life easier for your receptionists or care navigation teams. So if you want to go into any of the ideas that we've discussed today in more detail, you are more than welcome to request further training from us. You can do that via the NECS help desk, 0300 555 0340. You can do it through the self-service portal. Obviously, that will come through to us as well. And we can do those. We're doing everything remotely still at the moment, but we can, schedule a team session with you. We can have a look at what you're trying to achieve, and we can help you get there with some of the tools that we've used today. And similarly, if you've got any questions now, I'm quite happy to stick around for a little bit. So I'll open the chat up. By all means, unmute yourselves. You're still on record, so everybody behave. But you are perfectly welcome to unmute yourself and ask any questions if you haven't. And as I say,
yeah, all of these sessions are being recorded, and the idea is that we will make a huge bank of content so everyone can access them in the future.
Perfect. And as I say, if this sparks a couple of ideas and you think, okay, that's a nice little overview, but I want someone to really sort of dive in with me now and have a look at whether we can achieve this for our particular circumstances, you know, by all means ask for further training. We can do that. We can go into a lot of detail, as you probably gathered. This is a bit of a kind of, here's what's there in System 1. But if there's a particular bit that you really want to get to grips with, I'm more than happy to do those with you. Good, that's what we go for, Christine. If it's popped up one thing that someone didn't know before, then it's been worthwhile doing it.
Amazing. Thanks for that, Ross.
Thank you very much.